What is the one material innovation in the pipeline today that will, in the next 5 to 10 years, say, significantly lower the impact of buildings?
I would say, the material that we use most of in construction is concrete. And in concrete, there's a lot of cement. And cement is the generator of a lot of carbon at the moment. And the industry is working very hard to change that. And we really do need to change that because we've got a lot of building ahead of us. We've got another 3 billion people coming onto the planet by 2050, according to the UN. We've got 1.1 billion people already living in inadequate housing due to rapid urbanisation and the planning of that since the 50s. And so it's really not a viable position to say we're not going to build anything, or in the privileged position perhaps we have in Europe that we're just going to retrofit the buildings we've already got. We have to figure out solutions for how we're going to use materials into the future to provide this, first of all, the basic need of housing, but then all of the things that go with it. So if you gave me one kind of magic wand wish, it would be that we could decarbonise cement and therefore concrete.
Are you saying then that in the next 5 to 10 years, we are likely to see a carbon neutral concrete or cement?
Of course, it's also about it being scalable. So you might be able to throw enough technology to make in the lab a carbon neutral cement, but trying to scale that so that we could use that on every project at the moment, that's not foreseeable. So it's more likely that we'll be working around process improvements, because of course the cement manufacturers are still trying to make a business, and there's only so much the market will pay for their product. But there's a lot of innovation going on. There's a lot of opportunities to improve the position, and there's a roadmap for the industry to reduce emissions quite substantially by 2030. But then beyond that, the sort of deep dive is carbon capture and storage, and that is a technology that's still being developed and still being deployed at scale.
If we do get to a point where carbon neutral cement is available, what does that mean for emissions globally? I mean, do you have a sense of what would change as a result of that?
Yeah, I mean, if you I'm going to round up the numbers a lot, but just to kind of give you some perspective, we could say we've got 50 gigatons of carbon being reduced. Emitted into the atmosphere. We need to be able to halve that fairly quickly to 2030 in terms of the buildings emissions, half of that, and then 2050 to get to net zero. So our contribution as the building industry to that, we have the number in our head of about 40%. So if you broke that down into where that sits at the moment, of course, there's a lot of buildings. The built environment's already got a lot of buildings that are built and in operation, and they're using up, say, 9 gigatons of that. And then the materials industry, construction is probably about 3 gigatons. So from that 40%, probably about 30% of it is buildings in operation, and 10% of it is in our materials. So I just rounded up the numbers a bit there, but that shows you how significant materials are now in the built environment. What we're trying to do by 2030 to meet those targets is get to a point where our buildings are net zero in operation, and where we've reduced the embodied carbon, so that's all of the carbon in the materials and the construction, by 40%. So there's a lot of work to do there. That's an ambitious target, and there's many measures that we're looking at to try to get there, and we can talk through some of those. There's no one magic answer to all of this. There's a whole series of responses, and they can also be very location specific as well.
Sure. Well, let's unpack the question of carbon step by step here. Break it down a little further. Talk to me about what decarbonization means and why it's important.
So in terms of why it's important, I think a reference that I've used a lot to try and explain to people some of the issues around materials and why it's important. There's a Canadian photographer called Ed Batinsky, and he photographs landscapes where we've made a big impact. And some of his pictures are really, they're very beautiful pictures, but they're also very dramatic. The most dramatic one I would refer you to, and it's worth looking up, is an image of nickel tailings. So it's a blackened landscape with a red river, the red coming from the nickel, running through the environment. And when you look at these pictures, you see the impacts that we're having, and you realise that what we're doing in the materials industry is having an impact elsewhere. When I saw this picture, I went off to try and find, what do we actually use nickel for? And I found that it was often used in stainless steel. And stainless steel, of course, is a product that we specify in buildings all the time. So generating that awareness and that sense, which I think is coming when I started this journey, looking at the topic of materials and the impacts that I had off-site some 10 years ago, it wasn't such a conversation. But now, of course, it's centre of developing sustainable buildings and sustainable ideas. So there's the off-site impacts of materials, but then, of course, the climate impacts. I'm living in Berlin, in Germany at the moment, and the extreme weather a couple of years ago caused flooding in the west of Germany like we hadn't seen before. And those impacts then of extreme weather events are coming, very close to a lot of people. Already been experienced quite significantly in other parts of the world. And if we continue on the path that we're taking, then of course global warming is going to have a massive impact on all sorts of things. Sea level rise, of course, heat temperatures in Africa. I was listening to Johan Rockström, climate scientist from the Potsdam Institute of Climate Change, talking about the potential, if we don't resolve the problems, to have to relocate people from say sub-Saharan Africa, and the impacts of that just unimaginable. We see how difficult it is to move people around from some of the very unhappy scenes we see around refugee crises and so on, and just imagine that at scale with climate change. It's it's catastrophic. So that's the of course the bit that's always there for us, the awareness of that. But I would pivot to say, that gives us a huge challenge and an opportunity, because I do feel like the global community has started to mobilise a lot to do something about it. Mm-hmm. We're still a bit slow. We've still got so much to do. But it's starting to happen. So we've got an opportunity through dealing with carbon to change a lot of other things as well at the same time.